The ruthless Duke wanted 2 sisters to himself, then ended up with none. The rain had not stopped falling on Ashford Cemetery for 3 days. It fell on the marble angels. It fell on the iron gates. And it fell, without mercy, on the fresh mound of earth at the far end of the grounds, the grave that bore no flowers, no mourners, and no tears. Only a name carved in cold stone. Silas Edward Leger, Duke of Ashford, 1841 to 1895. No one came to weep for the Iron Duke. There was a time, not so long ago, when the mere mention of his name made men straighten their backs and women lower their eyes. A time when Leger Manor blazed with candlelight, when his table seated 40, when kings of industry competed for a seat beside him. He had been the most feared man in 3 counties, perhaps in all of England. He had wanted everything. He had wanted a title that could never be stripped from him. He had wanted wealth that would outlast his enemies. He had wanted a legacy carved so deep into the bones of this country that 100 years from now, children would whisper the name Leger with reverence. And so, in the bitter cold of December 1882, Duke Silas Leger had done what men of his particular hunger always do. He had looked at what belonged to others and decided it was rightfully his. He had looked at 2 sisters. And he had decided to take them both. He never once considered that the 2 women he sought to own might be the architects of his undoing. He never imagined that the quiet one had steel beneath her silk, or that the fierce one had patience beneath her fire. He never thought, not even for a single arrogant moment, that they would choose each other over him. But they did. And when the end came for Silas Leger, it came not with violence, not with scandal, not even with a trial. It came in a room full of people, his peers, his witnesses, and it came dressed in the deafening silence of 2 empty chairs. This is the story of how the Iron Duke was broken. Not by the courts. Not by his creditors. Not by God. By 2 sisters who refused to be a legacy. There were 3 things London society agreed upon without argument in the winter of 1882. The first was that the Ashford Ball was the finest event of the season. The second was that Cook's new department store on Oxford Street was a marvel of the modern age. And the third, spoken in drawing rooms, over tea, in the careful murmur that polite society uses when it wishes to gossip without appearing to, was that Duke Silas Leger was in trouble. Not the sort of trouble one spoke of openly, of course. The Iron Duke was still the Iron Duke. He still arrived at every engagement in a lacquered black carriage drawn by matching greys. He still wore his suits cut by the finest tailor in Mayfair. He still carried himself with the particular arrogance of a man who has never, in his entire life, been told no by anyone who mattered. But those who looked closely, and there were always those who looked closely, noticed things. The east wing of Leger Manor had been closed for over a year. His racing horses, once the envy of the Derby circuit, had been quietly sold off the previous spring. And his solicitor, Mr. Prentice, a man not known for visible anxiety, had been seen leaving Leger's offices on 3 separate occasions looking like a man who had just been asked to do something he would rather not remember. The truth, known only to Silas himself and the increasingly nervous Mr. Prentice, was this: the Leger fortune was built on sand. His father, the old Duke, a brilliant but reckless man, had left behind not just a title and a manor, but a web of debts so cunningly hidden that it had taken Silas nearly 4 years to understand the full scope of his inheritance. The estates were mortgaged. The investments were failing. And the old Duke, in a final act that Silas could only interpret as deliberate cruelty from beyond the grave, had inserted a clause into his will so peculiar, so specific, that Silas had read it 17 times before he accepted it was real. The title and estates of Ashford shall pass in full to my son, Silas Edward Leger, on the condition that he marry, before his 42nd year, a daughter of the House of Thames of Wiltshire. Should this condition not be met, the entirety of the Leger holding shall be dissolved and the title shall revert to the crown. Silas was 41 years old. He had 8 weeks. The Thames of Wiltshire were not nobility. They were something that old money found simultaneously useful and distasteful. They were new money, the kind earned rather than inherited. Edmund Thames had made his fortune in textiles and railways, the unglamorous machinery of the modern world, and had raised his daughters in a house that was large, comfortable, and entirely without a title to its name. Edmund Thames had 2 daughters, and they could not have been more different if they had tried. Virginia Timms, the eldest at 24, was exactly what a duke's wife was supposed to look like. She was fair and composed, with the kind of quiet loveliness that watercolor painters favored. Soft edges, careful colors, nothing to startle the eye. She moved through rooms the way candlelight did, warmly and without fuss. She played piano beautifully, spoke French competently, and had never once, in the memory of anyone who knew her, raised her voice above what was considered appropriate for a lady of her station. Society adored her. Mothers pointed to her. Younger girls studied her from across ballrooms and tried to imitate the particular way she smiled. Gracious without being warm, interested without being eager. She was, in the language of 1882 London, perfect. Silas Leger, the moment he saw her, understood exactly what she was worth to him. Melissa Timms, the youngest at 21, was another matter entirely. She was not plain. She was, in fact, striking in the way that interesting faces always are, full of expression and opinion and something that moved behind her eyes like a fire that had not yet decided what it wanted to burn. She read voraciously and without discrimination. History, law, economics, novels that respectable women were not supposed to have opinions about. She asked questions in conversations where women were expected only to listen, and she had a particular habit, maddening to some and magnetic to others, of looking at a person as though she were quietly taking them apart to see what they were made of. She had turned down 2 proposals already. Both men had described the experience, privately and with some bafflement, as feeling like they had failed an examination they hadn't known they were sitting. Silas Leger, the moment he saw her, understood exactly what she was worth to him too. And that was where his trouble truly began. Because a man of ordinary ambition would have chosen one sister and been grateful. But Silas Leger had never been a man of ordinary ambition. He looked at Virginia and saw a wife, the kind of wife whose name in the papers would silence questions and open doors. And he looked at Melissa and saw something rarer, a mind sharp enough to untangle the wreckage of his finances, if pointed in the right direction. He wanted both. And so he began to plan. He never once asked himself whether they might want each other more than they wanted him. The thought, quite simply, did not occur to him. It would, eventually. But by then it would be far too late. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. He arrived at Tim's estate on a Tuesday, which was, as he later reflected, exactly the right day for the beginning of a deception. Tuesdays had no ceremony to them. No one expected anything remarkable on a Tuesday. Edmund Timms received him in the drawing room with the particular eagerness of a man who understood what a duke's carriage in his driveway meant for his family's standing. He offered brandy. He offered a tour of the grounds. He spoke at length about his railway investments and said the word partnership 4 times in the first 10 minutes, which Silas noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who recognizes hunger in another and knows how to use it. The sisters were brought in after tea. Virginia entered first, as was proper. She was everything he remembered from the Hartley dinner. Composed, luminous, carrying herself with that effortless grace that no amount of money could teach if it wasn't already in the bones. She smiled at him in precisely the right way, said precisely the right things. He watched the afternoon light fall across her face and thought, yes, the papers will love her. Society will accept her without question. The title is safe. Then Melissa walked in. She did not make an entrance so much as she simply appeared, unhurried, taking the room's measure before she had fully crossed the threshold. She sat, folded her hands, and looked at him, not with the careful blankness that well-bred young women deployed as armor, but with open, unambiguous assessment, as though he were a ledger she was not yet certain balanced. He asked her, by way of conversation, what she had been reading lately. She told him. It was a treatise on corporate insolvency law. He kept his expression pleasant. Beneath the table, he pressed one hand flat against his knee to keep it still. By the time Edmund Timms refilled his brandy, Silas had revised his plans entirely. Virginia would make him legitimate. That had not changed. But legitimacy, he was beginning to understand, was only one half of his problem. The ledger accounts were a battlefield. Years of his father's hidden debts buried beneath layers of misdirection, and he needed someone with the ruthlessness to dig through them and the intelligence to understand what they found. He had spent months looking for such a person among his associates and had come up empty. He had not thought to look in Wiltshire. He needed them both. The idea came to him fully formed, the way his best ideas always did. Not as something invented, but as something simply recognized, as though it had been waiting for him all along. He would not choose. Not yet. He would propose instead an arrangement. He spent the carriage ride home composing the language in his head, careful as a surgeon. By the time Mr. Prentice arrived at his office the following morning, the outline was ready. A dual guardianship contract, rare, but not without precedent in families navigating complex estates. Both sisters would relocate to Leger Manor under his formal protection while the terms of an engagement were negotiated. It was framed on paper as a gesture of generosity toward the Timms family. Edmund would be spared the difficulty of maintaining a household for unmarried daughters while discussions of such delicacy were ongoing. Edmund Timms signed it 11 days later, flushed with pride at being received as a future peer's equal. Virginia signed it because her father asked her to. Melissa signed it last, slowly, and looked up at Silas when she was done with those same steady eyes. She did not smile. He told himself it did not matter. Leger Manor received them on a gray Friday morning, its iron gates swinging open with the slow theatrical certainty of a trap. Virginia called it beautiful. She stood in the entrance hall and turned in a slow circle, taking in the vaulted ceilings and the portraits and the chandelier that caught the weak winter light and scattered it like something precious. Her eyes were bright. Silas watched her from the doorway and thought, "Good." Melissa said nothing. She looked at the portraits, generations of Leger men, all with the same set jaw, the same flat eyes, and then she looked at the locks on the interior doors, and then she looked at Silas. He gave her his warmest smile. She turned away first, which he chose to interpret as shyness and which was not. The campaign began that same evening. It was never obvious. That was the point. Obvious men lost. Silas Leger had not come this far by being obvious. For Virginia, there were jewels, a sapphire pendant delivered to her room before dinner on the third day, accompanied by a handwritten note that called her a woman worthy of a duke's name. He seated her at his right hand at every meal. He solicited her opinion on the manor's decor in front of the staff. He was building her an identity inside these walls, one careful brick at a time. The future duchess, the chosen one, the woman who had won. He knew precisely how a life spent being perfect in the hope of reward could make a person cling to its arrival. For Melissa, he used a different currency. He found her in the library on the fifth morning, unsurprised as though he had known she would be there, and sat across from her without invitation. He asked about the book. She told him. He engaged with it seriously, asked questions that demonstrated he had actually listened, and then, at the end of the conversation, leaned forward slightly and said, quietly, as though confiding something he had not meant to say aloud, "Virginia is everything society requires. But you are the only person in this house I find genuinely worth speaking to." He left before she could answer. He repeated variations of this every few days. Never too often. He was not manufacturing devotion. He was manufacturing doubt, which was a far more durable material. He wanted Melissa to believe she possessed something Virginia did not, something that could not be bought with sapphires. He wanted Virginia to sense, without being able to name it, that Melissa occupied a room in his regard that she could not access no matter how perfectly she smiled. He wanted them to watch each other. He wanted the small, corrosive question, "Does he prefer her?" to sit between them at the dinner table every night like an uninvited guest. For 3 weeks it worked beautifully. He mistook their silence for rivalry. It was something else entirely. She found it by accident, which was perhaps it was a Wednesday night, the manor quiet and dark past midnight, when Melissa came downstairs for the book she had left in the study. The door was ajar. The lamp was still burning. And Mr. Prentice, who should have been in London, was seated across from Silas at the great oak desk, his voice low and fraying at the edges in the way that careful men's voices do when they are frightened. She did not go in. She stood in the dark of the hallway and she listened. It took her 10 minutes to understand what she was hearing. It took her another 5 to accept it. The overseas venture, copper mines in South Africa, the kind of investment that promised everything and guaranteed nothing, was not funded by Leger money. There was no Leger money. The mortgage on the manor had been extended twice already. The creditors were patient only because Prentice had been feeding them promises, and the promises were running out. What was keeping them at bay now, what Silas was counting on to buy him enough time to turn the gamble into a return, was the Tim's dowries. Both of them. Already committed. Already spent, or nearly. She went back upstairs with the book she had come for and did not sleep. In the morning she went to Virginia. She was careful. She laid it out plainly, without drama, the way you might explain a column of figures to someone learning arithmetic. This is what he owes, this is what he has used, this is what we are to him. She had even written it down, numbers and dates, in her clearest hand. Virginia listened with her hands folded and her face very still. Then she said, "Melissa, you have never liked him." Melissa said that had nothing to do with it. Virginia said, "Doesn't it?" And there it was. The thing Silas had planted and watered and waited for. It bloomed right there in Virginia's sitting room, ugly and fast-growing. Because the truth was that Silas had spent weeks whispering to Virginia about her own worth, her own primacy, her own special claim on his regard, and when a person has been carefully taught to believe they have won something, they will fight to keep it even when no one is trying to take it. Virginia said Melissa was jealous. She said it quietly, with genuine sorrow, which was somehow worse than if she had shouted it. She said that Melissa had always resented her for being chosen first, and that this, all of this, the papers, the figures, the midnight theories, was simply what jealousy looked like when it dressed itself in reason. Melissa left the room without another word. She sat in the library for a long time after, very still, looking at nothing. Somewhere in the east wing, she was almost certain she could hear Silas Leger moving through the corridors, unhurried and quiet, like a man who has just watched something go exactly according to plan. He gave it a week. That was the measure of the man. He was never hasty when patience would sharpen the blade. He let the silence between the sisters settle and harden. He let Virginia's hurt calcify into certainty and Melissa's fury cool into something quieter and more dangerous, which he mistook for defeat. He moved through the manor in those 7 days with the easy confidence of a chess player who has already seen the end of the game, and on the 8th evening he made his next move. It was not complicated. The best traps rarely are. He told Virginia, just before dinner, that he had something of a personal nature he wished to discuss, something he was not yet ready to share with the household. He asked if she would walk with him in the gardens afterward, privately, when the staff had retired. He said it with just enough vulnerability to make it feel like trust. Virginia, who had been raised to believe that a man's willingness to confide was a form of intimacy, said yes. He had sent word to 3 people before she finished her soup. They were seen at 10:30, a duchess-in-waiting and a man who was not yet her husband, alone in the dark garden unchaperoned. The witnesses were well chosen, discreet enough to make it feel like an accident, well connected enough to ensure it would not stay one. By morning, the shape of it had already begun to travel. Virginia came to him white-faced at breakfast. He received her with practiced gravity, as though he too were only just comprehending the weight of what had happened. He said he was sorry. He said he had not considered how it might appear. He said carefully that he saw only one honorable course available to them now, and that he hoped she would allow him to make it right. She said yes to that too. He had the engagement announced by Thursday. With Virginia secured, he turned to Melissa. He found her in the library as he always did, and this time he did not sit. He stood in the doorway and he told her plainly, without theater or malice, the way one might discuss household arrangements, that he had been patient with her interference out of respect for her intelligence. He said that the engagement was now a matter of public record, that the Timms family's future was tied irrevocably to his, and that any further attempt on her part to destabilize that future would leave him no choice but to act in the interest of the household's well-being. He mentioned, almost as an aside, a private institution in the Scottish Highlands. Excellent reputation. Very remote. For women whose nerves had been strained by difficult circumstances. He let the sentence finish itself. Melissa did not move, did not speak, did not give him the satisfaction of a single visible reaction. He left her there among the books, quite sure he had won. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The letter arrived inside a copy of Middlemarch. She did not know how it got there. The book had been on the library shelf that morning and she had not touched it, and yet when she opened it after lunch the envelope was there, pressed flat between pages 212 and 213, as though it had always been a part of the story. There was no name on the outside. Only 3 words in a cramped, urgent hand. Read this alone. She did. The man who had written it introduced himself as Thomas Hale, formerly head valet at Leger Manor for 11 years, dismissed without reference in the spring of 1879 after he had made the mistake of knowing too much and saying so to the wrong person. He wrote the way men do when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally found somewhere to set it down. Quickly, without ornamentation, with the particular relief of someone who has stopped pretending. He wrote about a woman named Catherine Foss. She had been the daughter of a Lincolnshire landowner, quietly wealthy, quietly spoken, engaged to Silas Leger in the winter of 1877. The engagement had come with a contract, unusual in its terms, generous on its surface, that had given Silas effective control of her family's assets while the wedding date was negotiated. The wedding date was negotiated for 14 months. During those 14 months, the Foss accounts were systematically drained into a shipping venture that collapsed spectacularly in the spring of 1878. Catherine's father died of a heart attack 3 months later. Catherine herself never recovered from either loss. She died in January of 1879. The official cause was listed as fever. Thomas Hale had been in the house. He knew what fever looked like. He knew what it looked like when a woman simply stopped wanting to continue. Melissa read the letter twice. Then she sat very still for a long time, not thinking about Catherine Foss, but about her mother. Eleanor Timms had died 6 years ago, quietly and without fuss, in the way that women who do not wish to be a burden tend to die. The family had been told it was her lungs. Her father had accepted this without question, as he accepted most things that came with official explanation attached. But Melissa remembered things that a grieving 14-year-old notices and files away without understanding. The letters her mother burned in the grate the winter before she died, the name she said once in her sleep that was not Edmund's, the particular way she looked at the portrait above the mantel sometimes, not with love but with something older and more tired. She went to her father's correspondence trunk that evening, the one he had sent ahead when they moved into the manor, the one she had never had cause to open before now. It took her an hour to find what she was looking for. It was a letter, 15 years old, from Eleanor Timms to Edmund Timms, written before their marriage. In it she described, in careful and diminishing sentences, the end of a previous engagement. She did not name the man directly. She called him only S. She said the contract had taken everything her family had. She said she was grateful to Edmund for his kindness. She said she did not expect to feel very much anymore, but that she would try. Melissa folded the letter. She placed it inside the copy of Middlemarch beside Thomas Hale's. Then she stood up and smoothed her dress, and walked with great calm down the corridor toward Virginia's room. She did not knock gently this time. Virginia was still awake when Melissa came in. She was sitting at her dressing table in the lamplight, not looking at her reflection so much as existing in front of it, the way people do when the mind has gone somewhere the eyes cannot follow. She turned when the door opened, and something moved across her face, not quite surprise, not quite relief, and not quite the defensive composure she had been wearing for the past 2 weeks like a second skin. Melissa closed the door behind her without a sound and locked it. She did not begin with the letter. She began with the ledgers, the figure she had copied out in her own hand from what she had heard through the study door, laid out now on Virginia's dressing table in plain columns that required no interpretation. The mortgage extensions. The creditor payments outstanding. The date by which Prentice had calculated the venture would need to return a profit or the entire structure would collapse. She watched Virginia's eyes move down the page the way eyes do when they are reading something and simultaneously trying not to understand it. Then she placed Thomas Hale's letter beside the figures. Then she placed their mother's. Virginia read all of it. She read slowly, with the particular stillness of a person who has decided not to react until they have reached the end, which Melissa recognized as courage of a quiet sort. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she said, "He was going to sell the Wiltshire house." It was not a question. It was buried in the ledgers, a line item dressed in legal language, disposal of Tim's property assets upon marriage, and Virginia had found it herself without being directed to it. Melissa said yes. The house their father had built. The house where they had grown up, where their mother had kept her garden, where the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway still had the pencil marks recording how tall they had grown each birthday. It was already accounted for in Silas's calculations, already spent in his imagination, already gone. Virginia was quiet for a very long time. When she finally looked up, something had changed in her face. It was not dramatic. There was no fury, no tears, no moment of theatrical awakening. It was subtler than that and more permanent. The particular expression of a person who has been looking at something from the wrong angle for months and has simply, at last, turned around. The softness did not leave her face, but it relocated. It was no longer directed outward, no longer arranged for the benefit of a room or a man. It gathered itself inward, and what replaced it on the surface was something clear and unhurried and resolute. She said, "What do we need to do?" And just like that, they began. They talked until the lamp burned low, and then they lit another, and they kept talking. Virginia knew things Melissa did not: the manor's daily rhythms, the staff schedules, which solicitor had handled their father's original accounts, and whether he might still be reached. Melissa knew things Virginia did not: the precise shape of Silas's debts, the timeline of his desperation, the narrow window in which a man who believes he has already won stops watching the door. They were not the same. They had never been the same. But somewhere in that locked room, in the small hours of a cold night, they stopped being opponents in someone else's game and became what they had always, underneath everything, been. They were sisters. They were their mother's daughters. And they had work to do. Silas chose the second Saturday of December for the ball, which meant he chose it at the precise moment the social calendar was fullest and the papers most hungry for something gilded to print. He spared nothing. He could not afford to spare nothing, which was exactly why he did it. A man teetering on the edge of ruin must never look like it, and there is no disguise more effective than extravagance. 300 invitations went out. The florists came on Thursday. The caterers came on Friday. By Saturday afternoon, Leger Manor had been dressed in white roses and candlelight until it looked like something from a painting, beautiful and entirely unreal, which was, Melissa thought, rather appropriate. The theme was masquerade. Silas had chosen it himself, delighted by the romanticism of it, the drama of the unmasking at midnight when he would announce the engagement to 300 of London's finest. He did not consider, because it did not occur to him to consider, that a masquerade was also a room full of people who could not be certain who they were looking at. That was the first gift he gave them. The second was the chaos. By 9 o'clock the manor was alive with it. 300 guests in costume and masks moving through the candlelit rooms in a current of silk and laughter and conversation that required constant navigation. The staff were stretched. Silas was occupied, moving from group to group with the particular energy of a man performing his own triumph, receiving congratulations on an announcement not yet made, his mask pushed up on his forehead like a crown he had already awarded himself. He did not notice the sisters arrive separately. He did not notice that Virginia danced every dance with a different partner, visible and vivid and perfectly placed, drawing eyes the way she always had, so that anyone asked later would confirm yes, she had been there, she had been present, she had been the very center of the evening. He did not notice that Melissa was hardly there at all. She had spent the preceding 10 days being invisible in plain sight, which was easier than it sounded in a house where everyone had already decided what she was. The solicitor, their mother's old family solicitor, not Prentice, never Prentice, had been contacted through a letter carried out by a laundry girl who asked no questions because Melissa had been kind to her in October, and people remember kindness longer than they remember instructions. Documents had been prepared. Arrangements had been made. And the jewels, Virginia's sapphires, the pearls, the diamond earrings presented with such ceremony in the first weeks, had been quietly assessed and quietly valued and were now, piece by piece over the course of 4 days, no longer in Virginia's room. Tonight, the last of it moved. Thomas Hale, who had not set foot in Leger Manor since 1879, was not among the guests. He did not need to be. He needed only to be at the tradesman's entrance at 10:30 with a plain carriage and a steady nerve, which he was, because a man who has waited 7 years for justice develops patience as a matter of survival. By 11 o'clock, the documents were gone. By 11:30, the jewels followed. By 1:45, there was nothing left in Leger Manor that belonged to either sister except the dresses on their backs and the masks on their faces. Silas found Virginia at 5 minutes to 12, took her arm, and led her toward the grand staircase, beaming. She smiled at him from behind her mask and let him lead. He had rehearsed the speech 4 times. It was a good speech. He knew it was good because he had written it himself, and because when he read it back in the mirror that morning it had produced in him a sensation he recognized as satisfaction, which was the closest Silas Leger came to happiness. It opened with a classical reference, moved through a brief and flattering account of the Timms family's virtues, and arrived at the announcement itself with what he considered the perfect balance of authority and sentiment. He had even planned the precise moment to reach for Virginia's hand. He climbed the grand staircase at midnight with 300 faces turned upward toward him and felt, for perhaps the last time in his life, completely invincible. He raised his glass. The room quieted with the obedient hush of people who understand that they are in the presence of a man who expects silence and has, until now, always received it. He opened his mouth. The doors opened first. They did not open the way doors open when a late guest arrives, apologetically, partially, accompanied by whispered excuses. They open the way doors open when the people on the other side of them have been patient for a very long time and have decided, collectively, that patience is no longer a virtue they wish to practice. Both doors, simultaneously, with a sound that cut across the ballroom and silenced the last remaining murmurs as efficiently as a blade. There were 6 men. They wore no costumes and no masks. They carried leather cases and had the particular expressions of professionals performing an unpleasant task they have nonetheless performed often enough to do without flinching. The one at the front asked, in a voice calibrated precisely to carry across a ballroom without needing to shout, whether he was addressing the Duke of Ashford. Silas said nothing. The man introduced himself as a representative of Caulfield and Associates, acting on behalf of a consortium of creditors to whom the Leger estate owed, in total, a sum he then named aloud, in full, in front of 300 people, without pausing. The number landed in the room like something physical. Silas turned to his right, where Virginia had been standing. She was not there. He turned to his left, where he might have expected to find Melissa, though he could not have said why he looked for her in that moment except that some animal instinct was beginning, too late, to understand the shape of what was happening. She was not there either. He scanned the room, the sea of masked faces. Suddenly all turned toward him with an expression he did not immediately recognize because no one had ever directed it at him before. It was pity. It was the specific, terrible pity of witnesses. They were not in the room. They were not in the manor. They were, at that precise moment, 2 hours outside London in a carriage that smelled of cold air and leather, sitting across from Thomas Hale with their masks in their laps and the Timms family solicitor's documents in a case at their feet, watching the dark countryside move past the window in silence. Virginia had taken off her sapphire pendant at the edge of the city and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then placed it carefully in the case with everything else. Melissa had watched her do it and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Behind them, in a ballroom full of London's finest, the Iron Duke stood at the top of his staircase with a glass raised and no one to toast. He had wanted to. He got none. The school had no grand name. Virginia had suggested something classical and Melissa had overruled it on the grounds that girls who were not yet certain they were allowed to take up space did not need to be greeted each morning by a Latin phrase telling them to aspire. They settled on Timms House, which was plain and accurate and theirs, and that was enough. It sat at the edge of a village in Dorset, a wide-windowed building that had once been a farmhouse and still smelled faintly of timber and open air even in the depths of winter. There were 23 girls enrolled by the 2nd year and 31 by the 3rd. They came from the kinds of families that had daughters and not enough imagination for what to do with them. Girls who were too clever for the drawing room and too poor for finishing school and too determined for anyone's comfort. Melissa taught them mathematics, economics, and the kind of careful reading between lines that she had learned, at considerable personal cost, to do herself. Virginia taught them everything else. How to move through a room without disappearing, how to speak so that people listened, how to be gracious without being diminished. Between the two of them, they taught their students the one thing neither of them had been taught at the outset: that intelligence and composure were not opposing forces but a single, formidable one. They did not speak of Silas Leger often. There was no need. He had been, in the final accounting, less a villain than a catalyst, the thing that had pushed them toward each other and toward themselves, and they had long since decided that gratitude was too generous and bitterness was too expensive, so they filed him away under neither and got on with the business of living. Virginia kept a small garden behind the school where she grew things that had no practical use and were simply beautiful, and she tended it with the same quiet attention she had once directed at other people's opinions of her. Melissa kept a correspondence with Thomas Hale, who had used the reference she wrote for him to secure a position with a firm in Edinburgh and who sent, every Christmas, a brief letter and a book he thought she had not read. She had usually read it. She wrote back anyway. They were, by any measure that mattered, happy. Leger Manor was cold now in a way that had nothing to do with the season. The east wing had been closed for years. The portraits still hung in the entrance hall, but the candlelight that had once made them look imperious now made them look merely old. The furniture was draped in dust sheets in the rooms Silas no longer used, which was most of them, because a man who has lost 300 witnesses to his ruin finds that the world becomes, very quickly, a much smaller place. He sat at the dining table on a Tuesday evening. It was always Tuesdays now, though he could not have said why, with the table set for 3. It had been set for 3 for years. He had stopped telling the housekeeper not to bother, because telling her not to bother meant acknowledging why, and there were things Silas Leger still could not bring himself to say aloud even in an empty room. He talked sometimes. Not to anyone present. To the chairs, perhaps, or to the particular quality of silence that had settled into the manor the night the doors flew open and refused, ever since, to leave. He had wanted everything. He had wanted a legacy that no one could take away. Outside, the rain had not stopped falling for 3 days. And that is the story of the Iron Duke, a man who tried to own 2 women and ended up with nothing but shadows and an empty table. If this story kept you hooked from the first chapter to the last, let us know by hitting that like button. It tells us you want more stories like this one. Subscribe if you are new here, because we tell stories every week that are equal parts history, drama, and justice served cold. And turn on the notification bell, so that the next time a villain gets exactly what he deserves, you are the first to know. We will see you in the next story.